We're welcoming today Larry Kidder, who's going to investigate or talk about his investigation of Dr. William Bryant. Was he a patriot? Was he a loyalist? Was he somewhere in between? We're really excited to have him here. He is doing this research with a grant from the Mercer County Cultural and Heritage Commission as helping the Trent House prepare for interpreting our part in the Revolutionary War as we look forward to the 250th anniversary of the Revolution and the founding of our country. So welcome to the William Trent House. If you haven't been here, this is what we look like. We're in downtown Trenton, surrounded by state parking lots, state office buildings, and highways. Built on land actually that William Trent owned, about 1,000 acres originally. But of course, it sits on the ancestral lands of the Lenape people who lived in what is now New Jersey, Delaware, parts of eastern Pennsylvania, in a territory they call Lenape-Hoking. We know this ourselves from archaeological work on site. And we know that during the colonial period and the early federal period, many Lenape people were moved west to Pennsylvania and then Ohio, and finally to Wisconsin and Oklahoma, and some north into Canada. But some have remained here and have continuing historical tribal communities. There are 3 state recognized Lenape tribes in the state of New Jersey. So we acknowledge them as the original people of the land and that they have a continuing relationship with their territory. Our mission for the museum is to share the authentic history of the house, the property, and the people with our communities, connecting the past with today and tomorrow. So on this slide, you'll see just a snippet of the various stories that we are hoping and trying to tell, doing research on. Colonial period, the Lenape, the enslaved people, Trenton's heyday as an industrial center, the Trent House itself as a Gilded Age mansion, and the impact of policies such as redlining on our city and on our site itself. We're very grateful to our donors and funders, some of whom the various organizations are listed here. And of course, we are always grateful for donations. You can make a donation via PayPal at our website. You can write a check and send it to us at our post office box, 77234, Trenton, New Jersey, 08628. And put on your calendars. Don't want to miss our next talk on May 5th by Reverend Charles Boyer. We'll talk about the history of Trenton's Greater Mount Zion African and Methodist Episcopal Church, which was organized in 1816 by the AME's founder, Reverend Richard Allen. Also, you'll hear more about the Revolutionary War period in New Jersey and what it was like to share a home with the military headquarters of General Washington in 1780. And that talk about the dimension will be given on May 12th. Both of these are on Thursday nights at 7 via Zoom. And especially look forward to Saturday in the end of August, August 27th, an all-day reenactment of the encampment of Washington's and Rochambeau's armies in Trenton in 1781. And we know, in fact, that the French army parked their cannon right next to the Trent House on land that was still the property of that associated with the Trent House before they crossed over the Delaware and continued down to victory in Yorktown. So you can stay in touch with us and find out about our upcoming events on our website, on Facebook, and you can sign up to get our e-newsletter, which is periodic. And finally, I'm excited to introduce our speaker, Larry Kidder. Many of you know him well. But just to highlight a few important aspects of his history and career, he's a well-known local historian, author, and speaker, and he's written a number of books on the Revolutionary War. You can see them listed here, of people harassed and exhausted. The Crossroads of the Revolution in Trenton, Revolutionary Princeton, and most recently, a book, The Revolutionary World of a Free Black Man, Jacob Francis, 1754 to 1836. Larry was a teacher for many years. He still volunteers at Howell Living History Farm and is active in a number of historical organizations, including serving on the Crossroads of the American Revolution Advisory Council. So welcome, Larry. Just a reminder, feel free to put your questions and comments in the chat, and we'll have a chance to share them with Larry and get his response at the end of his talk.
Okay, everybody, hopefully you can see my slides now.
Yes.
Very anxious to, or very happy to give this talk to you tonight. It's been a real interesting journey looking into the life of William Bryant and trying to understand him. I've always heard of him in all the things that I've done about Trenton as a Loyalist, and I kind of assumed that. But doing some research on him, it began to ask some questions. Was he a Patriot? I don't think there's a whole lot of evidence to indicate that, but you never know what's in a man's mind, as we're going to talk about today. It's also, as in the same way, difficult to classify him or label him as a Loyalist without any question either. So was he something else? Was he neutral, or was he sometimes a Loyalist, sometimes a Patriot? Do you go back and forth? You know, just what is his story? And that's what I'm going to try to get across tonight. If nothing else, it will leave you with some questions to ponder and some evidence that you can evaluate and see which direction you think it takes for you. He was born in 1730 in New York City. His parents lived in the city. His father was a ship captain, as well as a merchant who made a number of voyages between London and New York several times a year. It could take up to a couple of months to make a round trip, but he did it at least once a year, if not more. And he did that during the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, including during some of the wars, the European wars that spilled over here. And at one point he had a ship taken by a privateer and lost that ship, but he was returned and took another ship. But his father did well. He did not come from a poor family, let me put it that way. He went to Yale and graduated in 1747 when he was about 17 years old. College was a little bit different in those days. When he graduated, he wanted to become a surgeon, so he traveled to France, perhaps on his father's ship, and he looked at France as the center of surgical study at that time, and he wanted the best schooling he could get. After he learned his profession as a surgeon in 1759, he began service with the British Army as a staff surgeon at an army hospital on the island of Guadeloupe in the West Indies. When he got there, all the hospital supplies that had been sent out with the army had been consumed. Several of the medical staff that he was going to be working with had died recently. The picture that you see here, by the way, is a painting of one of the installations on the island of Guadeloupe at that time. During his first few months there, the encampment lost 8 officers and 577 men. This is not because there was a lot of war going on. It was basically disease. In September of 59, his duties expanded. They got a new governor on the island of Guadeloupe, a general, and William Bryant became his personal surgeon in addition to the other duties that he was doing. Most of his patients at the hospital suffered from tropical diseases, and it's very likely that he may have acquired them at some point also, as we will see. When the Treaty of Paris ended the war in 1763, he went on half pay. He retired essentially, but only for a few months until about February of 1764. When he got a new job, he took 2 commissions from the British, one as a staff surgeon again on the island of Grenada this time, but he was also purveyor of the force, which means he was responsible for accounting for the supplies, ordering medical supplies, that kind of thing, as well as the diet for the soldiers that were being cared for in the hospital and that sort of thing. So he was not just a minion. He was pretty high up in the hierarchy in that particular situation. And he served there in Grenada for about 3 years. And then he retired and again went on half pay in April of 1767. We know about his service, by the way, because it is recorded in a book that the British published every year or so, their medical staff and where they were. And this was the blurb for him in about 1789, because it does show his death also. And it shows that he was on half pay until 1787, which is actually the year that he died. He returned to New York, and on October 28, 1769, just about 2 years after he got back, he purchased what's now the William Trent House at Kingsbury, and bought it from Robert Lettuce Hooper. We don't know why he came to Trenton. It might have been just the advertisement in the newspaper for the property. Highlighted a couple of key things that might have appealed to him. The genteel brick dwelling, typical, sales argument there. The courtyards, the outbuildings, including the chair house for his 1-horse or 2-horse, 1-person vehicle, kind of a sports car of its day that the upper class people had. And its orchard, there was tons of trees in his orchard. So there's just a lot of things going on there that might have attracted him to that particular property. By November of that year, 1769, about a month after he bought the house, he was already a member of the Trenton Presbyterian Church. And the members of that church are going to be very deeply, or already were deeply involved in the protest movement against the acts of Parliament. We can say that the Presbyterians tended to support the cause. You still had some loyalists who were Presbyterians. And on the other hand, the Anglicans, which was the other big group of religious people in Trenton, they tended to be loyalists. But again, almost half of them were patriots. So you couldn't really tell just from their religion what preference they might take. And the same thing was true of occupations. Being a doctor, yes, a number of doctors remained loyalists, but also a number were patriots. Particularly in Trenton, you had another doctor who was a major patriot, actually led the militia in that area. And then you had in Princeton, not very far away, you had Dr. Bainbridge. If you know the Bainbridge House on Nassau Street, that was the house of a loyalist during the time of the Revolution. He made up for it by having a son who became an American hero in the War of 1812, whom I think the house is really honoring, not the father. But anyway, you just can't tell by position in the community what role a person might take. Dr. Bryant, as a physician, did gain a reputation pretty quickly for his skills, and also as a man of integrity and skill. People had him do various things for him that required honesty and really pretty hard work to help them out. It might be selling real estate, where he would be a go-between for people, things like that. He just got around the community very well. There's no evidence that I've ever seen that he supported the protests against the acts of Parliament. On the other hand, there's no evidence that he opposed them. He's just really a non-entity in terms of the buildup to the revolution and what side he might have been supporting. We don't know, for example, if he drank tea or if he abstained in order to go along with that protest. We don't know if he signed the Continental Association or ignored it. We don't know if he followed the requirements in the Continental Association about not using British products and things like that. Just not real sure about it. Also, the militia law that came into effect in 75, he was under the age of 50. He was in the upper 40s, so he was close, but he was definitely of the age that he should be in the militia. No evidence that I've ever found that he was prosecuted for trying to avoid service. It's possible that he sent a substitute. He had indentured servants, other people that he could have sent as a substitute, or he could have paid the fine up front, which means he wouldn't be prosecuted. But we just don't have any evidence of that. A lot of well-to-do men did hire substitutes or did pay the fine, and some of them may have had some loyalist tendencies, or at least were accused of having loyalist tendencies, but that doesn't seem to have happened to him. It's also possible he was excused from the militia because of physical impairment. Again, being around all those sick people in the West Indies, he may have developed some of those diseases also, and that may have cost him, health that was long lasting, not just while he was there. Most of the people in Trenton supported the revolution. There are a few loyalists that we'll talk about, but most people supported the revolution. But not everybody who supported the revolution was fanatic about it. There were a lot of people who, okay, I'll go along with it, but I've got a lot of things in my life and I can't spend too much time on it. There were other people who opposed independence and supported the British government. And again, some of them may have kind of put that aside and kind of gone along with whoever was in power at the moment, even though they might have in their mind wanted to oppose more openly. And then there were some who really did want to remain neutral, didn't care so much one way or the other. They were just looking at getting along in daily life and would accommodate whichever group was in power for the week, month, or whatever, and just try to stay out of the thing altogether. Some tried to remain neutral because of religion, of course, with the Quakers. Some changed their position as events unfolded. They might start out on one idea and then switch to another. And we'll talk about at least one man who did that. But I think it's important to look at the people in Trenton as being on a continuum, not being in two groups, either for or against the revolution, but somewhere along a line with the neutrals right in the middle, and then others that were weaker in their belief and in their desire to actually take action to support that belief. So it's not just two camps in Trenton. One interesting man, Bryant had been an officer during the French and Indian Wars. I believe he still was an officer at the time of the revolution, but he lived in New Jersey and went back to England in 1774, leaving his wife Mary housed in Trenton. He'd only been in Trenton for a short time when he left her there. But as the wife of a British officer, his wife Mary was considered by everybody to be a loyalist. That was what was expected. And according to another famous loyalist that we'll look at in a second, Daniel Cox, she added to her reputation of being a loyalist because she rather spoke her mind too plain. And I mentioned that not to bring attention to her so much as to indicate that whether a person did well as a loyalist in terms of their relationships with other people or not was very often just how much they talked about it, how plain they spoke about it. If they just kind of kept quiet and out of the way, even if they had loyalism in their mind, they might not be treated the same way as somebody who spoke about it too much or who acted like it too much. One man that I think is very important is Charles Harrison, who was a militia captain for the company in Trenton, wholeheartedly supported the efforts to restore American liberties against the acts of Parliament. After all, he took an officer position in the local militia. That put him as a strong patriot. However, he could not support the cause anymore when independence was declared. So on July the 8th, the day the Declaration of Independence was read aloud in Trenton, he resigned his militia captain's commission and he joined the Loyalist military forces. And he changed sides right there. And I particularly like his story because he's not the only person that happened to. He was prominent enough that it made the news, so to speak. But there were a lot of people in Trenton who may have supported the protests, but then backed off to some degree, again, more or less, in their support for it because of the Declaration of Independence. Now, Dr. Bryant himself has long been labeled as a loyalist, or at least of having loyalist tendencies. But Dr. Bryant had a real problem in living his life during the Revolution because he had a couple of very strong interests that conflicted. If he were to take loyalist actions, he would lose his property. We'll talk more about that process as we go along. He would have lost it to the Patriots, etc. However, if he took Patriot actions and identified with that side of the struggle, he would lose his half-pay British Army pension. Now, that may not sound like too much, but apparently it was pretty important to him. Anyway, somehow he kept both. He kept both his property and his pension. And so he was really kind of a really difficult situation dealing with other people to not express opinions too strongly one way or another. But what evidence is there to support the label loyalist, since that's kind of what he has done for himself with historians, if not with people at the time? His biographer in 1969, a man named Fred Rogers, who wrote for a physician's journal, said that during the War of Independence, Dr. Bryant evidenced Tory sympathies. He backed off a little bit, just gave him sympathies. His name appears as a half-pay surgeon on the rolls of the New Jersey Volunteers, a loyalist regiment raised by General Cortlandt Skinner in 1766. Well, that sounds like he was a loyalist if he was with a loyalist regiment. However, the source for Rogers's statement simply says that Bryant was a surgeon on half pay, which he was, and makes no mention of a loyalist regiment. Kind of jumped to a conclusion that it was a loyalist regiment that he would have been on half pay with, rather than a regular British Army regiment. Rogers also incorrectly states that on January 23rd, 76, the Burlington County Committee of Safety, suspecting that Bryant might be planning to join the British Army at Boston placed him on parole, meaning he gave his word that he would stay within a certain radius of Trenton. Initially, and this is Rogers' words, not mine here. Initially, Rogers said he was restricted to a 12-mile radius of Trenton, and later that was expanded to a 30-mile radius to include Philadelphia. Now, to put that into perspective, Loyalists put on parole were generally restricted to a 6-mile radius, and there are a few exceptions to that of 8 miles and sometimes to as few as 2 miles. I point that out because the 12-mile radius is pretty liberal. The 30-mile radius is very liberal. And that kind of indicates the degree of concern that people might have about him as a loyalist. His document states, however, I do give my parole of honor to the Continental Congress that I will not go further than 12 miles from my present place of residence, except to Philadelphia, without the leave of Congress. So he's allowed to go to Philadelphia right from the very beginning. There's no second document that extended his ability to travel further. Also, some men who were given these paroles had to submit bond, submit money in trust to ensure their obedience to it. He apparently didn't have to do that. There was enough trust that he would go by his word that they didn't demand that of him. Now, the problem with the statements from Rogers is that it was actually the New Jersey Committee of Safety, not the Burlington County Committee of Safety. And they wrote to the President of Congress on January 23rd that the committee, having information that Dr. William Bryant of this place, a surgeon on half pay, was likely to join the British Army, agreeable to orders. In other words, he'd been ordered to Boston by the British Army. It wasn't that he was just thinking about doing it. He had been ordered to go. They thought it was their duty to take his parole to ensure that he didn't do that, and they enclosed it. And they also said his limits are extended because he practices sometimes about Princeton and his business and has business transact in Philadelphia. This is what got Rogers confused. His limits are extended. Not that they started out at 12 and went to 30. They started at both of those, but that was extended beyond what was normally given, as I indicated before. So when you look at documents, you got to read what was actually intended, not just the words themselves. That letter was signed by 3 Trentonians, all of whom were strong patriots at the time. Samuel Tucker, who was very strong in the new colonial, the new government. Isaac Smith, who was one of those doctors who remained a patriot and was colonel in the militia. Abraham Hunt, who was a local merchant and was lieutenant colonel in the militia. So these were 3 pretty dominant men. The parole actually raises the question, was it actually done as a favor to Dr. Bryant, not as something to keep him in line? Richard Smith, who was a New Jersey delegate to the Continental Congress, wrote in his diary on February the 5th that John Dickinson acquainted Congress that Dr. Bryant of Trenton, a surgeon on half pay, had received orders to repair to the ministerial army in Boston and desired leave or permission to do so. That permission was rejected by all but Dickinson for some reason. And this is, even though it's in red here and with parentheses, this is in the document itself, and perhaps was a contrivance of Bryant to save his half pay. In other words, if he'd been ordered to the ministerial army in Boston and didn't go, but could say he didn't go only because he was put on restriction and would have been arrested, locally and that kind of thing if he had tried to go, That would save his half pay. Now, why was he so concerned about his half pay pension? Did he fear that his poor health resulting from his Army experiences would eventually make him helpless and he would need that pension for supporting him in his old age? Was he politically neutral or even a patriot? But he had to finagle a way to keep his pension. And was this parole part of that finagling? We know that if Dr. Bryant had truly wanted to go to Boston, he didn't have to ask permission. He would have just gone. And a number of people who had loyalist tendencies did just leave town and go to New York when the British were there, or in some ways get protection from the British. If he had done that, he would have declared himself to be a loyalist. There would have been no question about it. And that would make his property, the William Trent House and the hundreds of acres with it, would have been subject to confiscation. Now, some loyalists had left town knowing that their property was going to be confiscated. Some left before late November, early December of 76, but a number chose that time because of the approach of the American Army. Some loyalists left after the Battle of Trenton in December. So virtually in December of 1776, anybody who was really a loyalist got out of town, even though the British had come in to take over. Dr. Bryant didn't either. He stayed in Trenton, whether it was an Americans running the show or whether it was the British running the show. Now, some other loyalists to compare him to, Daniel Cox, whom we mentioned before, was a prominent lawyer, a member of the Governor's Council. He was descended from one of the original landowners under the proprietary period, a very, very important man. Stated that he invariably opposed the insurgents, the protesters, in every conversation he had in public. He refused to assign the Continental Association. And because of that, he was frequently subject to much personal insult and danger, to the point of being threatened with tarring and feathering. Now, he's talking about this, by the way, when he's applying to the British government for reimbursement for losses that he suffered because of being a loyalist. With the American Army approaching town in late November, he wanted to escape arrest and imprisonment, so he left town. He left his property, perhaps knowing it was going to be confiscated, but he left his property in the care of his servants. And when I say servants there, I mean enslaved people for the most part, and also tenants, because he had properties that he leased out to people as well as properties that he lived in himself. And on December the 1st, he crossed the Delaware at the ferry, which at that point he also owned. Okay, so he's getting out of a place that he's very, very involved with, and he's going to lose a lot by leaving. He brought along with him his widowed mother, who had lived with him for over 40 years in Trenton, as he pointed out in his application, in comfort and affluence. And she later got out of the new United States altogether and removed to England even before the end of the war. Another loyalist, Isaac Allen, was a Trenton lawyer, and his family abandoned their home about the same time the American Army entered town, about the first couple days of December in 76. They traveled a short distance to an area controlled by the British, who were approaching also following the Americans, and they accepted Howe's protection papers, the proclamation that Howe issued in November, saying that anybody who swore loyalty to the king would be forgiven for anything they had done in the protest movements and all. And on December 3rd, he went further and took a commission as lieutenant colonel in the New Jersey Volunteers. Another lawyer, Joseph Taylor, who had a high reputation, displayed in his behavior an early and steady attachment to loyalty to the king and to the British government. He also refused to sign the association. He was fined for not turning out with the militia. And in December, again, when the American army was approaching, fearing that he was going to be imprisoned, just like Cox was, he abandoned his home and property and joined the British Army at New Brunswick also. Another man, former Sheriff John Barnes, and the sheriff there, this was the royal sheriff, he was the royal government sheriff in Hunterdon County, where Trenton was. He left Trenton in November before the American troops arrived, leaving behind his wife and property. Now, his wife got along okay after he left. She maintained his property. I believe he was a baker. And Washington even used his property at one point during the 10 days between the battles of Trenton and Princeton. And Barnes joined with the British Army also. He was commissioned a major in the 1st Battalion of the New Jersey Volunteers. The Reverend George Panton in Trenton was the rector of St. Michael's Anglican Church. He had a real problem because as an official in the Anglican Church, he had to swear loyalty to the king, as part of his religious commitment, and he wasn't going to deny that pledge. So he cooperated widely, not just in Trenton, but in New York, the rest of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. And as he said in his application for reimbursement, traversing these several provinces at his own expense. And because of that, he suffered a variety of dangers as well as hardships in his travels. And because of the problems in Trenton, because of being a loyalist, he was at last compelled to take refuge with the British in New York in the year 1776. I would point out also that the Anglican Church essentially ceased to operate for about 7 years during the Revolution. When Panton left, didn't open up again until the peace treaty. Strong loyalists who remained in towns where the British and Hessian soldiers occupied during that December of 1776 often took actions to help the British. The Loyalists were happy to have the British soldiers around, and they wanted to help them. I mentioned Dr. Bainbridge in Princeton. He was one who really helped the British, and that really got him on the Loyalist side as far as the Patriots were concerned. He had tried to kind of go both ways or stay neutral before that. Also, Loyalists living near Trenton came into town to help the Hessians, and actually the British before them, who were there for a week, and then the Hessians were there for a couple of weeks. Question arises, did Dr. Bryant actively assist the Hessians like other men who were known loyalists and loyalists from out of town? We do know that during the occupation, the Hessians occupied, or they didn't occupy, they referred to Bryant's house as the Doctor House. And it's on a map that was done by one of the Hessian officers and identified that way. And we also know that the Hessians maintained pickets and guard posts on and near Bryant's farm. That's not because he allowed that, they just did it. He wasn't cooperating with them in any way, but they chose his location because it was on the Delaware River. And at the ferry, this is where the militia would cross to harass the Hessians. And so the Hessians had to have guard posts there to, stay on guard from those harassing attacks from the Americans throughout the month of December. At that location, there was always one commissioned officer, 5 non-coms, and 22 privates who were assigned to guard duty at the Doctor House and the Trenton Ferry. Now, General Stryker, William Stryker, in his book on the Battle of Trenton, tells a story about Dr. Bryant. He says on Monday, December 23rd at 11 a.m., Lieutenant Schwab of the Losberg Regiment encountered Dr. Bryant on King Street, the main street, Warren Street today, seeking Colonel Rawl, but they couldn't find Colonel Rawl. So Dr. Bryant left, went back home, promising that he would return later in the day because he really wanted to see Rawl. Well, he did return, and when he did, and they found Colonel Rawl, he told him that he had heard from a Negro who had crossed the river, Delaware, that the rebel soldiers had drawn rations for several days and were about to attack Trenton. It was traditional or common for the army to order the men to draw usually about 3 days of rations whenever they were going to go on some kind of an action. So that was a sign that they were up to something. And he said he learned that they were going to attack Trenton. Colonel Rawl apparently wasn't too impressed with this information and simply said, "This is all idle. It is old woman's talk." But Stryker then follows that up after seeing that Rawl didn't take it very seriously. Stryker says, "But the doctor," meaning Bryant, who was afraid of being robbed and having his house burned, took the matter more seriously. Now, Stryker had to assume that Bryant was a loyalist and was afraid of the Americans attacking Trenton, taking it out on him, particularly because of his being a loyalist, not just the fact that there was going to be military action around his house. So again, we've got this idea that he was a loyalist, but there's several problems with Stryker's story. First of all, how did the Negro get a boat to cross the river? If you know the story of the retreat across New Jersey and then Washington getting to Trenton and then crossing the Delaware to Bucks County, he ordered that everything that could float was to be taken across to Pennsylvania and nothing left behind in New Jersey that would be usable for the British to cross and follow after him. He had guards on those boats, and he had men right across from Trenton, New Jersey militiamen for the most part, who were going to prevent transportation back and forth across the river, except for those harassing attacks that the Americans were taking. So one wonders how this enslaved person was going to get across the river, learn something, and then get back again when he didn't seem to have the means. We also find out that Washington did not really tell his officers about the attack until the evening of the 23rd, so that the Negro would not have heard that on the morning of the 23rd or the day before on the 22nd. At least one soldier diary that I've seen says that he did not get orders to draw rations for several days until December 24th. So apparently that couldn't be a legitimate part of the story. Also, even if it seemed like something was coming up, the Americans have been crossing for harassing raids almost daily. So it would not have been uncommon. Perhaps that's why Rawl was so unimpressed with the idea that Americans might be coming. It's also possible that the story came from Lieutenant Schwab, who later reported this as part of the evidence, real or made up, in the complaint that some of the Hessian officers had that Rawl did not really prepare the town and prepare orders enough to prepare for the town if it was going to be attacked. And that's why they had problems. We know that Rawl didn't do any fortifications, redoubts or anything like that. He just was relying on the quality of his troops to prevent any overrun of the town. So that story has its problems, and there are no other accounts of Loyalist activity by Dr. Bryant during the Hessian occupation. Why is that? if he was a real loyalist, you'd expect to have seen some. His parole, of course, was meaningless because he was under British control. He could have gone, done anything, left town, whatever, but he stayed. But he must have kept a low profile because he didn't want the loyalists reporting that he was not cooperating, perhaps even joining with the British Army. He didn't even want the loyalists who came into town to help the Hessians to wonder what he was doing. Most of the other loyalists in town had gotten out, but he still had to watch what he said and who he said stuff to and that sort of thing. Because not acting like a loyalist, other loyalists could have reported him and he could have lost his half-pay pension. Well, the night of the crossing and the morning of the Battle of Trenton, at Bryant's house, at his guard post, there was one officer and 30 men of the Hessians. During the Battle of Trenton, and you see how I've imposed it right into the center of town right there, these Hessians at Bryant's place were among those who escaped and were not captured in the battle. They went to Bordentown, and Dr. Bryant could have easily escaped with them if he had been a pure loyalist, now concerned about the Americans coming back and all of that. No, he stayed. They went. After the battle, his biographer says, though known to be friendly with the Hessians, Bryant was not molested by the Patriots. The reason? He's guessing his professional value as a doctor apparently overshadowed political differences, and he attended casualties on each side of the conflict. Well, that's a nice thing to say and whatnot, but it's kind of overshadowing the idea of was he a loyalist or not. Rogers doesn't give any source for those statements that he made there. They're just assumptions on his part. But we're still left to wonder, did Bryant treat the wounded Hessians left with their medical people? I know there were several dozen very badly wounded Hessians that were left in Trenton when Washington went back across the Delaware on the 26th. And some of them are going to be there for several months. And Bryant could very well have treated some of them. He also could have treated Americans who were injured during the war, during the battle, and particularly the Second Battle of Trenton, or the Battle of Assunpink on January 2nd, when American doctors were, like Dr. Benjamin Rush, were treating the wounded. But we don't hear his name connected with anything of that. So we just don't know if he did that. Now, later on, after the Battle of Trenton and that whole time period is passed, the winter of 1777-78, when Washington was at Valley Forge, he sent his cavalry under Casimir Pulaski to have their winter quarters in Trenton, which causes a severe problem in Trenton that we won't go into. But his personal doctor was Dr. Nicholas de Belleville, who came over from Europe with Pulaski and is serving with Pulaski. He was from Metz, France, and he had also trained as a surgeon in Paris, very much like Dr. Bryant. He's a bit younger than Dr. Bryant, but he may have been in contact with some of the same people and certainly the same locations. Therefore, it seems he connected with Dr. Bryant, and perhaps because of their similar training. He took up his residence at the Trent House, known as Kingsbury then, with Dr. Bryant. Remember, he's about 20, de Belleville's about 25, Bryant is about 48. Belleville worked at the military hospital operating in the barracks, and that was a Continental Army hospital at that time. And to get there, he had to commute. So he traveled on foot. And one resident of Trenton who lived on Front Street, Mary Yard, later wrote about noticing how he traveled uh, by her house virtually every day as he came from the Trent House to Broad Street and then down Front Street to the barracks. So she, commented, and this was a long memory that she had about his daily commute. Well, the two doctors became very good friends, and Dr. Bryant encouraged Belleville to leave the Army and come practice with him in Trenton, have a dual partnership there. Well, Belleville didn't do that immediately. He stayed with Pulaski. He left town with Pulaski when they left towards the end of the winter. But then, not too long after that, he decided that he would get out of the Army and he would go back to Trenton. And in fact, he's going to make the rest of his life in Trenton and start a family that's going to develop several generations as a very prominent family in the town of Trenton. And he does go into partnership with Bryant. About the time that this is happening in October of 78, Dr. Bryant sells his Trent House property, Kingsbury, to John Cox of Burlington County, who was an official in the Continental Quartermaster Department. Now, it's my feeling that if Bryant were a loyalist, Cox essentially could have, confiscated the house, or the state could have confiscated the house and given it to Cox to use as a quartermaster's dwelling, because he was in Trenton, because Trenton was becoming a relatively important supply depot, and Cox worked for, he was second only to Nathaniel Greene, who was a quartermaster general at that time. So this is a big deal. If Dr. Bryant were a loyalist, again, this would have been unusual for him to be allowed to sell the property. Bryant himself purchased a smaller property in the town of Trenton. In fact, Bryant was getting ready to retire, essentially, or downsize his property and his business and his obligations and things that took his energy. And so he purchased a property in town, which leads to the question, how could he do that? Loyalists were neither allowed to buy or sell property. Loyalists had their property confiscated and sold by the government. And they didn't get the money from it. The government got the money from it. And there's many accounts of that, and newspaper accounts, and those loyalists who got out of town and left their property that we talked about before, they appear in the newspapers when their property is put up for auction, having been confiscated. So this doesn't make Bryant look like much of a loyalist here. Then on October in 1780, he was given money. Both he and Belleville were given money by the New Jersey Assembly. The Patriot government is going to pay Dr. Bryant for medical attendance to a man who was apparently in the militia. He might have been a Continental, but I think he was in militia. And he and Belleville had taken care of this man, again, a Patriot. So you've got, overload of Patriot in these various activities here. His biographer says that Dr. Bryant, described by Dr. Belleville as elderly before age 50. Something was wrong with Bryant that he aged so quickly. Perhaps, again, those fevers from the West Indies. But Rogers said he did not choose to leave his native land, as had numerous other loyalists. Again, assuming he's a loyalist. Well, Mr. Rogers, perhaps that's because he wasn't really a loyalist. That's why he stayed. At any rate, Bryant died in January of 1786 at the age of only 56 of an apoplexy, according to his obituary. In his will, he had definitely written a will, even though he died at a young age. He said, "I do hereby nominate and appoint my good friend and brother-in-law, William P. Smith, and my nephew, Belcher P. Smith, executors of this my last will and testament." He describes as his good friend one of the strongest patriots in the state of New Jersey at this time. And his son was also a patriot. Now, there is some indication that William Smith was not able to or did not choose to serve as his executor, but that could be for any number of reasons, not because Bryant was a loyalist and they disagreed and that kind of thing. But there just doesn't appear to be anything in Bryant's communications to indicate that there was any problems within the family, and Bryant would have been the only loyalist in the family. His obituary identified him as a longtime half-pay officer in the civil department of the British Army, and identified that he served during the French and Indian War, and makes no mention of his politics one way or the other, neither loyalist or patriot. They can't praise him for his being a patriot. They can't damn him for being a loyalist. So that leaves us with a question. Was Dr. William Bryant a loyalist, as he's been portrayed so often? Was he a secret patriot? Or just what was he? Was he a neutralist? Or was he a guy who was just looking out for his pension and also trying to keep his property, trying to maintain some kind of normal life for him, and therefore try to avoid going either direction to any extent? So that's basically the story. I can't leave without pointing out to you something that happened just within the last couple of days. Friends at Crossroads of the American Revolution accepted a story that I did for them for their Meet Your Revolutionary Neighbors program about Dr. Bryant, and they created an image from his portrait for that. So there is now, as of about 3 days ago, a document, word I'm looking for here, a biography of William Bryant for the general public, written as first person, as though William Bryant is talking to you. So I just had to mention that because I appreciate them doing that right at this time. So that's basically the talk. And
Well, thank you very, very much,
any questions?
Larry. I don't see anything right now in the chat, but people can feel free to unmute yourself. I think I'm going to allow that. I think that's possible. And see if you have any questions. Also, if you can answer that question that Larry posed for us. What do you think? Was he loyalist? Was he patriot? Was he just sort of trying to make it through these turbulent times that he was living in? Any thoughts?
Yeah, this is Dr. Brown. It sounds to me like he was indeed neutral. He was a good physician who cared for whoever.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't matter what uniform or no uniform they were wearing. And I only can imagine the chaos and topsy-turvy and the endless suspicions and everything. So he just did his best to keep safe and the people that he cared for safe. And I don't see him as, certainly not a patriot, and I don't see him as a flag waver. I think your comments about he could have easily gone into, farther north in New Brunswick or New York or wherever, but he didn't do that. So if he hadn't had that pension for medical reasons, he's still probably, I'm thinking he still would have been neutral.
He might
That's
very
my
well,
guess.
yeah.
He just he liked the area, and he was a doctor, and there's an awful lot of people in need of his care and service.
Thank you. Thank you for those comments. And certainly you made a cogent argument along with Larry that we should not put him in the loyalist camp, at least at the far end that Larry showed us the continuum there. Anyone else have either agree with that or have a different take on it?
Well, that was what I was going to say similarly, is that he must have, one, had a really great personality, that he got along well with people. He must have been very dedicated to his patients, and he must have been very well respected in the community, that both sides looked the other way and said, leave him alone. And, you know, he's caring for people, and whatever that anybody thought about which side that he might be on, they felt that he just needed to be respected and left alone, and everybody let him do his job and care for his patients.
Thank you. So to me, this raises a very interesting question of, and I think Larry laid it out very well, that we think of, you know, sometimes now we think of the world as divided into patriots or loyalists. You know, you were either on one side or the other, you had to make a choice, and you, whichever choice you made, you stuck to it firmly, and you know, we're strong in your beliefs. But you wonder how many people were in the middle. Does anyone else have that feeling?
Yeah, yeah, this is Dr. Brown again. I certainly do. I'm just guessing there were all kinds of people in the districts, in the area, that were in the middle, caught in the middle, and you know, just, you know, watching all this drama and violence go around them, and just trying to survive. And they were not partisans at all. I'm sure there were. I have an idea that was the majority, the surviving majority, not the vocalists, you know, and propagandists on either side. It's my guess.
Todd, I know you have done a lot of research on.
I'm anxious to hear what Todd says.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll thank you for figuring I might have an opinion on this. Yeah, well, first off, Larry, I think you did a fantastic job tonight, and in trying to figure out all the nuances and angles and everything else. It, for somebody who's done this for over 40 years, it sure ain't easy. Number one, I can confirm he had absolutely no relationship with the New Jersey Volunteers, so you're right about that. Two, it's, I don't know, I've never really been comfortable with the term neutral, but I've accepted it because there's, I guess, not another word to really figure in what some of these people were. I don't know, in my head, a lot of these people just would have been happy with whoever was over them, whether it was, you know, the British or you know, a new American government. Fine, just let them go about being a farmer or a doctor or whoever they were. Whether that's neutral or just, I don't know, status quoist, if that's a term, fine. But I don't know, I always draw back on James Moody from his narrative published towards the end of the war, when he mentions he was a plain contented farmer in Sussex County. When all the this is when the popular cry was join or die, said Mr. Moody chose neither, which I thought was a great line, until some Patriot militia came and started shooting at him. Then he took an active part. And that's the thing, the British did not mandate that you do any service for them. They would have been really more than happy if people had just stayed home and minded their business. The Americans, however, well, i.e. the state of New Jersey and most other states, obligated people to serve in the militia, as you know, you certainly covered. And if you didn't, you were fined unless you provided a substitute for you, which a lot of people did. But you know, that certainly had its costs. People made a living out of being substitutes. That's not an exaggeration. So it's hard. Now, whether this gentleman was a loyalist or a patriot, I think he's just a guy who wanted to survive the war, have his house, have a roof over his head, get his half pay, which was a big deal, which you nicely covered. That was a big deal to a lot of people. So for whatever a myriad of reasons, and you can. I think people today can have a sort of empathy with that and can relate to that. And this is a guy who just wants to get through difficult times, which I don't think anybody can argue about, and as best he can. And as a doctor, he wants to, be true to his Hippocratic oath, to treat the sick, do no harm, all that kind of stuff. And the revolution is replete with instances of surgeons or doctors of both sides who did just that, provided for medical care of friend and foe alike, because that was what drove them into that profession in the first place. And for the most part, no one held that against them. So this is a fascinating topic, and I think a credit to everyone that it was covered tonight. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Todd.
Yeah, thank you very much, Larry. Oh, Carol, I see you have your hand up.
Hi, thank you, everybody. This is fascinating. I'm trying to remember, and I know many of you on tonight must have been involved with this. Several years ago at the 1867 sanctuary, I guess it was around Christmas time, there was a presentation, a play. It was the trial of, and I don't think it was Dr. Bryant. I think it was
Abraham Hunt.
Abraham Hunt. And so I was just thinking that through and comparing it and contrasting it. And I thought the talk tonight was fabulous. And I was also thinking about the 1867 church presentation, the theater presentation. It was fabulous because they had up in the balcony folks that were supposed to be representing judges and overlooking the audience, and the audience had to do what we're doing right now. Was this person a patriot or a loyalist? But it was Abraham Hunt. You're right.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's fascinating. It's just completely fascinating. And I guess there are really answers and no answers.
Well, with Abraham Hunt, he was a patriot.
He was. Okay, good. Thank you for telling me that. It was several years ago, and I'm just trying to piece it all together. But I remember the actual theatrical presentation was totally outstanding. Tonight's Zoom talk was totally outstanding. But back in that 1867 sanctuary, like you were there in Trenton in the day.
Yeah.
It was wonderful.
Good.
One of the things I think of when we say that New Jersey was the crossroads of the American Revolution is what it must have been like to be ordinary people with armies marching back and forth and so on, and how many people were just trying, as you said, their best to stay alive, keep their family together, maintain their occupation and so on. And Todd, you point out that while the British weren't looking for soldiers to join their forces, they had professional, so to speak, soldiers. The Continental Army was and needed it and didn't have a lot of coin to purchase materials and supplies. So I think it would have been a struggle for many people to think about, how am I going to, I understand the arguments for being a patriot, but right now I'm in the middle of a war zone, and I don't know whether I'm ever going to get through it into a stable society again. So I think this is a fascinating topic. I think it's something that we're going to look forward to Todd's talk later this summer on something similar, and to some other people talking about, for example, what we was like to be a Patriot family, but have George Washington camp out in your house for several months while he was up there at the Dye Mansion. So we'll hear several stories of people struggling with how to live through this tumultuous time. So Larry, thank you very, very much. We look forward to, at the Trent House, we look forward to the additional research you're doing for us, but my goodness, you've really produced a wonderful, wonderful set of information for us to share and for something for us to think differently about, because we have traditionally said that the house was owned first by a loyalist and then by a patriot. We can certainly say John Cox was a patriot, but maybe we can't say that Bryant was a loyalist. We have a much more complex story to tell now.
Yeah, it was a wonderful presentation, Larry. It's always wonderful to, shed light, and it's so difficult, in particular with a very short life like Bryant had, and apparently no offspring. Apparently he never married.
Well, no.
He did.
I didn't really get into that story because of time
Okay.
limitations.
Yeah.
He was married, very
was.
definitely.
Okay.
And what's
But
really
he had no children by his
He had
wife.
no children.
He
Right.
did have a son out of wedlock,
yes,
Okay.
who
whom he cared for in his will as well as during his life. He acknowledged, he made no denial that it was his.
Right.
right.
I wonder
And,
what happened. Larry, do you know what happened to the son? I mean, what happened to him?
He, I'm trying to remember how long he lived. I'm not sure that he lived a good long life, but I know
Yeah.
he got to adulthood. He did go to school and into a profession, but
Right.
it-
What-
Interesting.
Yeah, what
Yeah.
was interesting to me is that his Bryant's wife, as Larry said, Dr. Bryant made provision for the son in his will, but so did Mary,
yeah.
the wife, and her will
Mhm.
again continued to say this son is going to have part of my estate.
Mm.
She also manumitted the enslaved people that Bryant had left her in his will. So,
Mhm.
an interesting family story there.
Yeah, I would have liked to meet Dr. Bryant. He sounds like a very good man, a really, really good man.
Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us